Good afternoon and welcome to the Getty Villa. My name is Sarah Cole. I'm an assistant curator of antiquities here at the Villa, and I'm delighted to introduce you to our program today, which is related to our current special exhibition, Nubia, Jewels of Ancient Sudan from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Before we begin today's program, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Getty recognizes and is committed to undertaking the work to build relationships with these communities. So I will begin by giving a short overview of our current special exhibition, and then I'll introduce today's speaker. Nubia, Jewels of Ancient Sudan, is on view here at the Villa on the second floor of the museum through April 3rd, 2023. The exhibition features items of jewelry and personal adornment worn by royalty and aristocrats in ancient Nubia's kingdom of Cush. And on the map in this photo, you can see that Nubia is a region that covered part of what is today southern Egypt and northern Sudan. All of the objects in this exhibition were excavated in the early 20th century by the joint Harvard-Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition to Sudan, and they were primarily found in wealthy tombs. And as a result of these excavations, the MFA Boston has the largest and most significant collection of Nubian archaeological material outside of Sudan. The exhibition covers approximately 3,000 years of ancient history, beginning with the rise of the Kingdom of Cush at the city of Kerma in present-day Sudan around 2400 BC. Jewelry from Kerma reflects the use of organic materials like shell and ivory, and the development of faience production in Nubia, which is a bright blue glazed ceramic material, as well as the skilled craftsmanship that was used to work with materials like gold, quartz, and semi-precious stones like cornelian and amethyst that were locally available. This period, the Kerma period, came to an end around 1500 BC when Egypt invaded and seized control of Nubia. Several hundred years later, when the Egyptians withdrew from Nubia, the kingdom of Cush reasserted itself, this time at a new capital city called Napata, around 750 BC. And it was during this period that the Nubians invaded Egypt and ruled there for about 80 years as the 25th dynasty. Then after being driven out of Egypt, the kings of Napata continued to rule the kingdom of Cush. And during this time, we see an influx of Egyptian influences in the jewelry and the self-presentation of Nubian royalty. Many exquisite items of personal adornment were created in the Napatan period, and most of the objects in this gallery come from the burials of kings and queens. In the later Napatan period, the administrative center of the kingdom of Cush began to move further south to a city called Meroe. And by around 350 BC, the royal cemetery had moved there as well, beginning what we call the Meroitic period. This period corresponded with the conquests of Alexander the Great, which included conquering Egypt, and then the rise of the Roman Empire. The kingdom of Cush maintained its independence throughout these political changes, but also had connections to Greco-Roman trade networks. And so at this time, we see some Greek and Roman influences coming into Nubian jewelry, but it still has a very distinctive local character. At Meroe, artists were exceptionally skilled at gold working, and they also employed enameling techniques using powdered glass added to the surfaces of items of jewelry to create very colorful patterns. This period came to an end around AD 350, which is where the exhibition concludes. And now on to today's talk. Our speaker this afternoon is Debora Heard. Debora is an archaeology PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago, specializing in Nubian archaeology and Egyptian history and language. Her research interests focus on the history, religion, politics, and women of ancient Nubia and Egypt. Multidisciplinary in her training, she integrates anthropology, archaeology, Egyptology, Nubian studies, African studies, and Africana studies in her approach and analysis of ancient Nile Valley societies. Today, she will be discussing how ancient Nubia has been assessed and understood from antiquity up to the present day, asking, what do we know about ancient Nubia? How do we know what we know? And why don't we know more? So please welcome Debora.
Thank you for this very warm reception. I would like to thank the Getty for inviting me to give this lecture today. I want to thank Lisa for working with me with these slides. We have been going back and forth for the past week about how to present these slides, and also to Sarah and all the other people at the Getty Museum for making this happen. I would also like to give a special thanks to some people who probably don't get thanked very often, and that's the cleaning staff. Now, if you've seen the exhibition, you know that you can get up really close to the objects, and they're very small, and I did that yesterday. I went and I looked at the objects, and I was able to get really close, and at one point, it was like I could almost touch the object, and the glass was so clean, you barely knew it was there. So I would like to thank the cleaning staff for doing that, allowing us to see. All right, so when we first started talking about this presentation, we talked about some of the historical reasons why people in general don't know about Nubia. And this lecture will make that only a part of the discussion. We will begin by framing this analysis in terms of perception and context. And the way to think about Nubia in today's lecture is to think about Nubia is in the eye of the beholder. So who's actually looking at Nubia? The evidence that we have and that we use for analysis and to interpret significance is itself framed by the people writing the text, drawing the pictures, and depositing the objects and descriptions that we use as evidence. So we will frame our discussion by exploring the relationship between the Nubians and the people making these records and interpretations, and then placing them within their respective historical context so that we can better understand how we should be looking at these records and these interpretations. So we will begin by defining Nubia. First, it's important before we begin to understand one thing. Human history is a history of migrations, and that's particularly true on the African continent, where Homo sapiens, modern humans, have been walking across the landscape for over 300,000 years. Long before there were boundaries for a land that we call Egypt or Kemet, and the land that we call Nubia, there were just people walking across the landscape. These people were walking across the landscape of the Nile Valley and the deserts to both sides. They had no national identities as Egyptians or Nubians because neither Egypt nor Nubia existed. What we can identify archaeologically are clusters of groups sharing similar cultural traits, such as pottery or burial customs. When we move into the time of groups settling together and clustering in areas to form settlements, and later uniting to form kingdoms and states, we have boundaries within which we can now analyze the people who live within those boundaries. So this is the modern map showing the political boundaries between Egypt and current-day Sudan. The other map shows the ancient boundaries between Egypt and Nubia. So you notice that it's moved a little bit further north, the Nubian border. In this map, we see that what we see as current-day Egypt at its southernmost point was a part of Nubia. It was Lower Nubia in ancient times. So we can see that there is a shifting of borders between the modern and the ancient, so we have to keep that in consideration. These are the major archaeological periods that we have for the Nubian landscape. Now, let me also say this. Nubia is not the ancient name for this area, but it appears in maps dating from the 15th, 16th century. We also know about a group of people who were called Nubians who came into the Nile Valley around the 1st century. So, and Nubian people still exist in both Egypt and Sudan. So it's a name that continues, a people that continued. But archaeologically, we were able to identify that there were several groups of people that inhabited the landscape that we call Nubia, and they had shared cultural traits. Based on these archaeological traits, George Reisner, who was the curator for the Museum of Fine Arts and who excavated most of this Nubian material, was able to categorize and label these people in groups and develop a chronology that we basically still use today. One of the things that we're going to talk about as far as current ways of knowing about Nubia is the way that we use terminology to talk about it. So the earliest period was known as the prehistoric period. In going back and analyzing and thinking about the terminology that we use, there was a distinction between the prehistoric and historic period based on writing. We, in analyzing and going back about how we think about those periods in history, we understand that we can't just dismiss the knowledge that people had before they had writing. So this earliest period, we need to consider renaming because we want to get out of that mindset that the history needs to be divided between people who write and people who don't. So this earliest period, I labeled the lithic period because what we're really looking at is the different types of stone tools that are being used by these people. So we have the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic periods, and you can see that it's very early in history. It's when people were still very mobile. We have the A group, the C group, and when George Reisner was putting these labels, they were meant to be just kind of temporary, but he didn't get around to renaming, and we still use these labels to today. There was a B group, but later analysis showed that it was a late form of the A group, so the B group does not exist anymore. We have the Middle Kingdom colonization, and that is when Egypt came in and occupied Lower Nubia. So that's the reason why it says Lower Nubia only. So this colonization period lasted about 300 years, but it just covered the area of Lower Nubia. Upper Nubia was still, people were still coming together and forming their own types of political and social formations. And so that is the area that became known as Cush. So the earliest Kerma formation, Kerma being the site of that early Cush society, began before 3100 BC. So this is happening up in Upper Nubia. But we have another colonization period during the 18th dynasty. That's when it begins, where Egypt invades Nubia again, and this time they conquer all the way up to Upper Nubia. And that is because, and we'll talk about that later, the Cushites of Kerma were a threat to Egypt. They had become wealthy, they had become powerful, and so they were becoming a threat. So when the Egyptians got rid of the Hyksos from Lower Egypt and reunified after the intermediate period, they turned their sights on Nubia and colonized, and this is also during the period of Egyptian empire. When Egypt finally withdraws from Nubia, and it's not like they were being benevolent, things were going to pot in Egypt, so they had to leave. But also the Nubians were fighting back. The Nubians were not just passive people being occupied. There were battles that they continued to fight even after, because the Egyptians ended up fighting the people in Kerma for like over 75 years to even gain a foothold into Nubia. But once the Egyptians left, the Nubians were able to reorganize themselves. And over that period of time, they began to form stronger political organizations around the fourth cataract at the place called Napata, and you'll see that in the exhibit. But this is the second Cushite. We call it Cushite Kingdom, Cushite Empire. Some of these Cushite kings actually go into Egypt. And so they become the Egyptian 25th dynasty. So these are kings from Napata. They ruled there for 75 to 80 years. They were run out by the Assyrians. And once they leave Egypt, they continue to rule in Nubia for, the Nubian Empire, the Cushite Empire lasts for well over 1,000 years. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So the second Cushite period is divided into two periods, the Napatan period and the Meroitic period. Meroe is that other site that's a little further south. But it's not as if Meroe did not exist during the Napatan period, because we do know that the kings, the princes, would actually be in Meroe. And so when they were called up to serve in the Egyptian army during the 25th dynasty, they were coming up from Meroe. So Meroe was a center even during the Napatan period. And then we have the post-Meroitic period, where Cushite dominance is basically eradicated. And people attribute it mostly to Aksum becoming a power. Aksum is the area where what we call Ethiopia. And there we have the Christian period and the current Islamic period. So let's move into our knowledge, or rather the evidence that we have about ancient Nubia. And for that, we begin with its nearest neighbor, of course, being Egypt. Now, remember I said that we will be looking at perception and context. Now, you may ask, why don't we just start with what the Nubians said about themselves? And that is because for most of Nubian history, the peoples that settled in the Nubian Nile Valley did not engage in the practice of writing. They practiced an oral tradition that passed on knowledge and history orally. So most of the textual evidence that we have about Nubia comes from people outside of Nubia. And now the relationship between people settling along the Nubian and the Egyptian Nile River goes all the way back to that Paleolithic period that we saw previously. And during this millennia-long history, the people in Nubia and the people in Egypt mostly have lived as peaceful neighbors. But at times they were fierce opponents and competitors. This is reflected in the Egyptian iconography and in the Egyptian text. In the pre-dynastic period, when the Egyptians were coming together and forming, the people in Upper Egypt, the people in the south, were fighting to gain dominion over the north, Lower Egypt, and to unify that part of the Nile Valley all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. So there were also battles that were happening to the south as well as to the north. Nubia is a land, or was a land, that was rich in raw materials that were desired by the Egyptians. Things like gold, gemstones, and special types of stones that were used for making statues. The wealth and the prestige of Nubian chiefs would occasionally come into conflict with the desires of Egyptian kings, and this would result in raids and in war. Some of the locations, most of the locations that we know of that existed in Nubia, we know of from the Egyptian records. The earliest attestation we have of someplace in Nubia is Ta-Seti, which means land of the bow. And one thing that we do know about the Nubians, based on the archaeological material, but also based on material culture like models, is that they were excellent archers. So they were valued for their archery. Ta-Nehesy, which means land of the Nehesy, this is one of those things that we would probably talk about later, maybe in the Q&A, about how do you define Nehesy, because that's something that Egyptologists took a position on early on that proved to be problematic. Wawat is the name that was used for Lower Nubia, and then, of course, Cush became the dominant power in Upper Nubia. When we look at the stages of settlement and growth along the along the Nile River Valley, you can see the earliest formations here being the pre-dynastic period. So this is before Egypt is unified into a state. And you can see that there are settlements, there are people clustering all along the Nile River in both Egypt, what becomes Egypt and what becomes Nubia, but also in the desert regions. So there are people all over the Nile River. But you can see a gradual change, and part of this also has to do with climate change. The area is becoming more arid, it's becoming drier, so people are seeking more permanent sources of water because you have to feed yourself and you have to drink. So you began to see these settlements also extending and growing larger along the river. This is continued growth. You can see that there's a definite cluster where you see Nagata 1. That is the culture that becomes the dominant culture in Egypt and unifies the whole state. But then you see right next to it is the A group, which are the Nubians. And so you have to understand that at some point they're going to come in conflict, because the Nagata culture, you see that last map, has stretched all the way to the north. So they are the dominant power in Egypt. And there's just this little gap between the two. Is there really a gap? That's one of the things that current archaeologists have been talking about and examining, is that relationship in that border region between the A group and the Nagata. Is there some cultural mixing going on between the two? So those are things that we have to consider. But here is our perspective. We're in the period of Antiquity. We're in Egypt, and we're during this Old Kingdom period. Egypt is trying to assert its power over the Nile Valley. It's becoming this powerhouse. Trade has already been established. So even in the early dynastic periods, Egypt is already trading outside of Africa, but it's also trading things coming from further inside of Africa. This is where the conflict comes in, because Nubian chiefs are becoming prosperous as well, with all of these resources that are in Nubia, but also coming from the south. Some of the things that the Nubians had, of course, was the gold. A lot of the gold that was mined was coming from Nubia, but also from those desert regions to the east and west. So that at some point, that there is going to be conflict. This is a relief found in Nubia during the UNESCO excavation when they were building the Aswan High Dam. And it shows a bowman, most likely a Nubian, being taken captive by, you see Horus on the Syrinx, so that's the earliest attestations for the Egyptian king was that Horus falcon, and that continues all the way through Egyptian history. But this is in the early dynastic period. You have that Horus on the top of that palace facade. So it's basically showing that the Egyptian king has come down and that there has been some type of battle with the Nubians. And on the other side, I'm focused on this one because the person that's being taken captive has the bow behind his back. So the bow is being used to immobilize him. So the thing that he uses for his dominance is being used against him to hold him captive. But it shows conflict. So it's not interesting to record hundreds of years of just cordial living. Nobody wants to read that. Nobody's going to spend time with that. what you have, what you have recorded are those battles where the king can show his dominance, that he's powerful. So this is one of those things that we see this very early in Egyptian history, but this is actually in Nubia. So this king has come and he's defeated some Nubian foes, and then he's left his signature. This is what I did. I came down to Nubia, conquered, and then I left a record of it. But one of the other resources that was prevalent in Nubia that the Egyptian kings liked was diorite, this beautiful black stone. And so several Old Kingdom Egyptian kings would create these huge statues made out of this beautiful black stone. And you can look at it, it's shiny. It has these, like flecks of gold in it. So it has this very majestic look, but it comes from Nubia. So I'm sure that these kings originally would be able to just go to the mine and get all the diorite that they wanted and get all the gold that they wanted and take it back to Egypt and fashion it in whatever way they wanted. But as these A group chiefs became more powerful, they began to have to negotiate. Oh, hold up. You can't just come into my region and take what you want. We have to negotiate. So there's the conflict. So over time, these Egyptian kings were having to negotiate for the things that they had been previously able to just go in and get. And of course, that led to conflict. In the fourth dynasty, King Sneferu was the first king. His son, Khufu, built the pyramid, right? Sneferu built his own pyramids as well. But he has a record in the Palermo stone where he talks about conflict in Nubia, where he actually went in and took 7,000 Nubians captive and took them to Egypt. So again, we don't have the peaceful relationship, we have the wars, the battles. But we know that this happened because and I'm not going to go back in the slides, but there was a gap between the A group and the C group. So archaeologically, the A group kind of disappears from Lower Nubia. And there's a time where archaeologists just basically have said that it was uninhabited. Somebody inhabited it, but it wasn't the Nubian A group anymore. So it seems that there were some of these battles and conflicts with the Egyptians caused the people who previously lived in Lower Nubia to leave for a while, or maybe they were taken away, as Sneferu talks about. But we have this, so we understand that there was a time when Lower Nubia was uninhabited by these A group Egyptians. But later, by the 6th dynasty, we find out that there are people there again. And we know this because the Egyptians are going there asking for help. They want mercenaries to work to come and help them fight toward the north because they're having conflicts with people to the north. And so they're recruiting mercenaries, and the place that they go to get those mercenaries are the Nubians that are living in Lower Nubia. So that's an interesting kind of turn of events. But it's not all about conflict during that time period. So in the exhibit, you see these beautiful ivory cuff bracelets. They're made during the Kerma period. So we talked about the fact that Kerma, was further south. So they were developing and at peace because the Egyptians were mainly in conflict with the Lower Nubians. But we know that Upper Nubians had relationships with people in Egypt before this time period. So this is from a drawing of a burial of an Upper Egyptian elite in Nubia, not in Nubia, in Egypt. And he's wearing these ivory bracelets. Now, they're not the exact same type as these that we have here, because these on the right are kind of like pointed. So they're a specific type of ivory bracelet. But we see that it shows us that there are peaceful relationships between the Egyptians and the people of Kerma or Cush as it's developing during this early Old Kingdom period. And so instead of conflict, we know that there are peaceful relationships. And so we sometimes have to look at the fact that what is written does not always encompass all of the relationships. We have to be more critical than that. And this is basically from a text by David O'Connor, where he's describing what's going on here. At Shalel, George Reisner excavated many A group graves labeled Cemetery, I think that should be Cemetery A, and none later than early First Dynasty. However, one peripherally located grave dated after the A group, so remember, there's a time when it's depopulated in Lower Nubia, to the early Third or early Fourth Dynasty. The burial was clearly that of a Nubian. The grave was small, but its male occupant wealthy and of high status, wearing an elaborate gold necklace and holding two valuable copper objects. On the upper part of each arm was a large V-shaped armlet in ivory of a type never found in Lower Nubia, but worn by some elite or upper-class upper Nubians in the Sahure reliefs mentioned above. And that is the person that's depicted on the right. Now, Sahure was a 5th dynasty Egyptian king. He built, in addition to the pyramids, he was one that built these sun temples. And so in the causeway of the sun temple, he has a depiction of different groups of people. And one of those people is this Nubian that's depicted here. But you can see that he's wearing that V-shaped armlet. As the man was not a prisoner, his gold necklace and other goods make this unlikely. He seems to have been an elite Upper Nubian who died unexpectedly when visiting Egypt, perhaps for trading purposes. And that's talking about the burial, not the other one. Some elite Upper Nubians may have settled permanently in Egypt, for even earlier, in early dynastic times, an Upper Nubian depicted on his gravestone as wearing a V-shaped armlet was buried in Egyptian style at Helwan near Memphis. So this kind of complicates what we see in the historical record. Nubian kings inscribing scenes of battle, scenes of conflict, but the archaeological record shows that there was peaceful relationships as well. So we have to keep that in mind. So again, perspective and context. The historical context is we're showing the Egyptians are trying to show dominance, but dominance does not tell the whole story. So we have to engage it critically in that way. When we move into the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, there is, for Egypt, it's a time of reunification. So the country has come apart. It's been engaged in a civil war between the North and the South. And the South, again, is the one that exerts its dominance and reunifies the Egyptian state. In so doing, we have to think about, okay, this is another time period of some conflict. Maybe they need to show some dominance again. So what does that look like in relationship to the Nubians? Well, we also have to consider that there are peaceful relationships with Nubians during this time period. So we see the existence of Nubian warriors actually in Egypt. So this is a stela from inside of Egypt that shows a Nubian warrior. So there's a cemetery of C group and Pangrave Nubians inside of Egypt. They had been serving in the Egyptian military, and they had their own burials inside of Egypt. You see that he most likely had an Egyptian wife. And other than the fact that he's depicted a little darker, he doesn't look much different than what you would see as an Egyptian. He is wearing a broad collar. The thing that really identifies him as being outside the fact that he's a chocolate brown instead of a red brown is the belt that's around his waist. And so we see that frequently in the C group. That lozenge pattern is seen on pottery, but it's also seen on warriors when they are going to battle. They wear this leather belt that has these lozenges. So this is typical of what we would see of a C group Nubian male, I should say. But in this Middle Kingdom, when there is this kind of fight for dominance, one of the things that happens is that we begin to see the prominence of Nubian women in Egypt. This is Queen Kawit. She's one of Hotep II's Nubian wives. Hotep II was the last king of the 11th dynasty. He's the one that reunifies Egypt after the first intermediate period. And so he continues to rule after he has, unified the Egyptian state. But he has these women, these wives, that are obviously not Egyptian. They are Nubian, and they're depicted in a way to let you know that they have Nubian characteristics. So this is one wife, Kawit, and she's getting her hair done. Most of these scenes for these queens in their burials is of them grooming, and we know that, Nubian women like to get their hair done. Queen Kemset, and what's interesting about that is Kem means black. S is the feminine, she's black. And Queen Ashayet. Queen Ashayet is one of the other Nubian wives of Hotep II. So if the Egyptians thought so poorly of the Nubians, would the Nubian pharaoh have at least 3 to 4 Nubian wives? I think not. So again, you have to question perspective and place it in a context to understand what's going on. One of the other things that we see in this time period is that there are women ruling in Nubia. So we'll see this later in the Meroitic period, but as early as this time period in the Middle Kingdom, there's at least one woman that's ruling. She's a chief because we have chiefdoms at this time. We don't have a unified state. But there is a woman that is leading her group. She is the ruler. How do we know this? This is from a cache of execration figures that was found that dates to around the 12th dynasty. Execration figures, think voodoo doll. You would write the name of your opponent, or at least the country, the tribe, and you'd write a curse. So that's what that inscription is. Now, how do we know that there's a woman involved? Because there were about 6 of these figurines that were found, and only one gives us the feminine ending that indicates they're talking about a woman. So Heka is the word for ruler, and it means basically foreign ruler. But her title has a T. That little semi-circle is the T. So it's Hekat. And you would say, somebody would say, well, how do we know that that wasn't just a typographical error? Because they go on to talk about how she was born of her mother, and it gives her mother's name. And then it talks about, at the very end, all of the pronouns are the S's, so that looks like a hook. That's an S. That's the pronoun for the feminine pronoun. So when you're talking about a woman or female, all the pronouns are S's. So this is a woman. And at the very end, it's talking about her troops. So there's a little piece that's missing, but it talks about her troops. So we know that during this Middle Kingdom time period, that there's a female chief in Nubia. How exciting is that? When we move into the New Kingdom period, we are talking about the age of empire. So our perspective changes yet again, because the Egyptians are not just, they're not moving just north, they're moving outside of Egypt. They have conquered all the way through the Levant and going up towards the Euphrates River. So they're all outside of Egypt. But they also have moved south. So remember I talked about that second colonization involved Upper Nubia as well. So they have moved all the way to Napata to rule over it. So if you're trying to exert or show your power, show your force, you are the ruler of basically the entire known world. That's how the Pharaoh is presenting himself. The ruler of the 9 bows, the 9 bows meaning the entire world. 3 times 3, 3 is a complete number. 3 threes are perfection. So he's the ruler of the entire world, the entire known world. That's how they're presenting themselves. It's political propaganda. But in order to show that dominance, in the iconography, we see a lot of depictions, of negative depictions of Nubians, but not just Nubians, but other peoples as well. But that has been taken, those negative connotations, those negative drawings, negative recorded reflections, those have been taken as meaning that the Egyptians totally disdained the Nubians. So again, we have to compare the perspective, the context, to understand what's going on. So a lot of this political propaganda. Here we see, this is a statue base, meaning there's another statue, there's a statue that sits on top of this. And these people look like, you know, in the position that they're in, the base, the top part of the base would be their backs. So you put a statue on top of it, you're putting this weight on the backs of these people. Who do they represent? One is the wretched great one of Naharan, which is Mitanni. Mitanni is up around Turkey and Syria. So to the north, these enemies to the north, and then the other one is the wretched great one of Cush. So that's the enemy, quote unquote, enemy to the south. So he's breaking the backs of enemies from north to south, symbolically. Here's a statue of King Ramses II, Ramses the Great, at Luxor Temple. And on the side of the statue base, you have this line of Nubians, or some people will call them Nehessu. This isn't something that's special just to Ramses. This happens throughout the 18th and 19th dynasty. You have these representations of these enemies, these captive enemies, to show your dominance. So all of this rests upon these captives. So it's showing, again, dominance over all of these peoples. And that one right there is Cush. And there are other Nubians named along there, but Cush is one of the enemies that is captive. On the other side, you have the Asiatics. So the Asiatics are the people to the east and north. And you have Naharan. So these named enemies become stereotypical enemies. Does that mean that they are disdained or disregarded? It's political propaganda. We see it again at Abu Simbel, and Abu Simbel is actually in Nubia. So Ramses II, as you walk into the temple, you pass these statues that are sitting on to the left and to the right. So they basically serve as a walkway. So they're like a causeway as you're walking past. And on one side, you have, again, Asiatics. They're not listed, but they're drawn so that you know who they're supposed to be. So these are stereotypical Asiatics. They're bound captive enemies. And then on the other side, we have the Nubians. And they're again stereotypically depicted as the stereotypical bound captive enemies. But this is from the wall scene of King Hui. I mean, not King Hui. Hui, who is the vizier under King Tut. So he has a relationship to King Tutankhamun. This is a very famous wall scene because it depicts Nubian peoples of various socioeconomic classes or different relationships to the king. So as they're coming, you notice that there are some at the very right. You see that there's one Nubian who's bowed all the way down to the ground. And he's depicted, they're wearing that belt. You remember we talked about that belt that the C group Nubians would wear. So they're attired in a certain Nubian fashion to show that they're Nubian, but these are Nubian princes. But behind those that are depicted in a typical Nubian attire, you see some that look like they are in Egyptian attire. The only difference between those young men that are depicted and in Egyptian is just that they're depicted in different shades of brown as opposed to the typical reddish brown that we see for Egyptians. But this one is really interesting because usually Nubians are depicted in one certain shade of brown. This what I call like the dark chocolate brown. But this one depicts them in a range of colors. So there's a range of shades of brown used to depict these Nubian princes. And this is probably one of the most accurate depictions of what Nubians, not only what they look like, but their relationship to the Egyptians. So they're coming, these princes, they are the princes, the highborn princes of the foreign lands. So they're coming to Egypt to be trained. They're coming as, we won't say tribute, but they're being brought to Egypt to be educated in the king's nursery. That's what nursery. But they're being educated in the capital by the king's tutors so that when they are of age and they become the ruler or take over from their fathers, that they can rule as basically an extension of the Egyptian king, because he's educated them and they'd have this loyalty. So, but you also see there's a prince in a cart, and then in the very back, not depicted that we normally would have the Nubians depicted. So you compare them in the back to the Nubians in the front, and you see that there's a difference. The people in the back look like they're wearing skin skirts or kilts. They also have ropes to make, so it seems as if they're being brought as tribute themselves. So they are coming as enslaved people. They're being brought as tribute. So we have a range. Now, are they actually Nubians or are they other people outside of Nubia? That's the question. How do we interpret who all these people are? This is the tribute coming from Nubia, but are the people that are being brought as tribute, are they actual Nubians, or are they people outside of Nubia that they've captured and brought to the Egyptian king? So that's the question. And I got to speed up a bit. So we talked about the fact that there are ruling women in Nubia. During the reorganization period, this is after the Egyptians have withdrawn from Nubia, and the Nubians have the opportunity to reorganize themselves. There is an inscription of a queen named Kadamala. And that sounds very non-Egyptian, of course, and it sounds very Nubian, not just Nubian, but it sounds more like the Meroitic names that we get later in the history. But she is here of her own accord as a ruler. And she's presenting in front of a goddess and being accompanied by probably a princess. And what she's doing, she talks in this text, it seems like she's benevolent because she's got her flowers and she's presenting to the goddess. But the text says something totally different than the picture. So in the text, she talks about the fact that it was either her father or her husband was the ruler. And he had allowed these groups, probably Egyptians, to come in and attack them and take away things from them, take their resources repeatedly. And he wasn't really effective in fighting back. And at some point he was killed or he died. And so she took over. So she became the ruler. And as ruler, she fought back. So she was like, we're not gonna let them come in and take our stuff. We're going to fight. And this becomes something, and it's probably why you have the one that was on the execration figure. The women of Nubia are fierce warriors. So you see that time and time again in the Nubian history, that they fight. So she talks about the fact that she's fighting on behalf of the god Amun. I'm coming, and not only are we gonna defend ourselves, but we actually gonna go there and take our stuff back and take it and give it to Amun. So we have these ruling warrior women in Cush, even before we've reorganized into the Cushite kingdom. So I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because I'm falling behind. This is a list of the early kings of Cush. So right after reorganization, there are some chiefs whose names we don't know, but these are the names that are associated to this earliest time period. Pianki is the king that goes in, and actually Kashta was the one that begins the incursion. I won't say incursion. The priests actually welcomed Kashta in because the Nubians came in as the upholders of the true religion of Egypt. They came in the name of Amun. And they were like these chiefs, these Libyan chiefs who are forming these competing dynasties. They don't understand the real religion. We come in the name of Amun. We understand how this religion, how we're supposed to be acting. We know how the king is supposed to uphold Ma'at by unifying the land. We understand all this. So the priests were like, yeah, we need y'all, come on up. So Kashta began that process. Pianki was the one who finished the conquest of Lower Egypt and becomes the first king of the 25th dynasty. And so those in italics are the 25th dynasty kings, and the ones after that are their successors that rule just in Nubia. But in the exhibition, we have these objects from the king Taharka. So he is one of the most famous of the 25th dynasty kings. We also get to see what was important for the people of Cush. So when Pianki went into to Lower Egypt, one of the things, and he actually records, he has a victory stela, so he records his progress through Egypt as he's conquering. and he was very upset about the way that they had been treating the horses. And so we find out that these Nubian kings have this, they loved horses. So they raised horses, and at El Kuru, which is the first of the royal cemeteries, there is an area that's set off for the horses. So the horses were actually buried at the royal cemetery. At least one, if not two horses per king. So this is, shows the plans and some of the descriptions of some of the things that they had in the horse burial. So they didn't just bury them, they were dripping in all kinds of beaded jewelry and plumes. And their burials got looted too, because they had nice things. The horses got arrayed just as well as the kings and queens. So these are the shafts. So they were buried standing up. Well, as upright as you can be when you're dead. But one of the things that Reisner noticed when he was excavating is that they were missing the heads. So he wondered, were they decapitated before they were put into the shaft, or that's a question we can't answer. But in the exhibit, we get to see some of the art, some of the things that were recovered from these horse burials. And the pictures don't really do justice to, because when I went to in the exhibition, I was like, these strings of beads they're large. But to go over a horse's head, of course, it has to be a long string of beads. But it also, this shows you how it was found in archaeological context, but also how you can put it back together. So you can see that the beads basically kind of fell in order that, in an arrangement where that they could be put back together. And this is the line of cartouches. So we move to talking about Greece and Rome. We're going to jump ahead in history. Ethiopia is the name that the Greeks used to talk about this land of Nubia. So it basically meant land of the people that are sunburned or kissed by the sun or burnt faces. And this is not to be confused with the Ethiopia of today. That Ethiopia became Aksum and Abyssinia. And we also have note of Merowe. So Merowe is that other center of the Cushite kingdom. One of the things that is notable for the Meroitic period, aside from the fact that they developed their own script and then they're able to write in their own language as opposed to writing in Egyptian hieroglyphs, which they had done in the Napatan period. But you have this line of these big ruling queens. They're powerful. And one of the things that we need to talk about in reflecting on how we think about the perspective and the context of these queens, looking at these queens, is how we talk about them. There are people who have talked about the fact that these women were fat or they were obese, and it's like, no, that's not how you talk about these women. These women were depicted full-figured to show their power, but they were also, she's dressed to the nines. She's got her shawl, her royal shawl. She's got captives, and if you don't notice, she's got her nails done. So she's totally feminine. She's all woman, and she's all conquering ruler. So to say that these women are fat or obese is disrespectful. I always think about, I grew up in the 70s, I have to, and I remember they used to have, bra commercials. Lucy and Ricky couldn't sleep together in the same bed, but they could have bra commercials on TV. But Jane Russell, and if you're of a certain age, you know who Jane Russell is. She's a big, full-figured woman, and she, her her tag on the Playtex 24-hour bra is for us full-figured gals. So that's what she used to say. And people thought she was beautiful. She was full figured, and they would say she's voluptuous, which meant she's big and she's beautiful. So that's how I characterize these women. They're voluptuous. They're not fat. They're not obese. They're showing I'm feminine, but I'm a ruler. I'm conquering, but I'm all woman. So she's voluptuous. She's not fat. So that's one of the things we're going to eliminate from our vocabulary when talking about the Cushite queens. But these conquering women, we have one of the queens, probably a Monteranus, and we know about these women from the Greek and Roman history, these histories written during Greek and Roman times. Strabo talks about her, calls her masculine, remember, perspective and context, calls her a masculine woman, one-eyed, so at one point I guess she was injured, probably in battle, and she had one eye. Okay, that's her props. You know, she's a warrior. I got one eye. I lost an eye in battle, but I'm still fighting. During the time when the Romans came in, so you know that the Romans defeated Cleopatra, Augustus became the emperor, and they again tried to move south into Nubia. The Nubians, and they were moving into Lower Nubia, but the queen in Meroe, which was most likely a Monteranus, began attacking because they wanted to get Lower Nubia back. They wanted to reunite Upper and Lower Nubia. So they kept attacking, and so they kept battling back and forth. Monteranus was actually going to battle with her troops. She didn't send her troops. She went into battle with her troops. It got to the point where Augustus was like, can we organize a peace treaty? Because this lady is not going to stop. We've been fighting back and forth. They'll take over, then we'll take it back, then they'll come back, and then they take it back. So they finally signed a peace treaty with this queen. But what's significant here is that during one of the raids into Lower Nubia, they took the head of Augustus from one of his statues in Nubia and took it back to Meroe. And they placed it under the threshold of the temple so that every time somebody went into the temple, they stepped on his head. Okay. So there are various biblical references to Nubia, most of them dealing referencing either Cush or Ethiopia, and we don't have time to really go through it, but if you can go through your Bible, do a search. You got an iPad, search Cush. You'll see all the references to Cush. Search Ethiopia in the New Testament, you'll see all the references to Ethiopia. Both are talking about Nubia. It's significant that Moses had a Cushite wife. Also significant that it was an Ethiopian that saved the life of Jeremiah the prophet. And then we have reference to Taharka. Western academia, so jumping forward into modern times, Egyptology developed during the late 18th century, so like the late 1800s is when Egyptology was forming. What has happened in that time period? Well, we know that Africans have been taken from their homeland and dispersed all over the world, all over the Western world as slaves. So the slave trade is active. Africa has been colonized by European powers. So there's a certain way in which the African has been dehumanized, because you can't enslave a person that you see as a person, and you can't treat them terribly if you recognize their humanity. So this is what has happened in that time period. So perspective, European Egyptologist, context, time period. We've gone through slavery, emancipation, but then there's also, we're dealing with Jim Crow. So there's a anti-Black sentiment already from the beginning. and I'm going to hurry up and go through this. We've seen Lower Nubia. When the Aswan High Dam was built in the late 60s and early 70s, it flooded all of that area that we know of as Lower Nubia. So there was an attempt to move some temples, so Abu Simbel was relocated, Philae was relocated, but then there were other places that were just flooded. One thing about archaeology is when you excavate, you go, you find out what's there, you develop interpretations, but then in developing your interpretations, you also have to test your theory if it's correct, so you go back to see if you can find something else. But unfortunately, when they did the salvage campaign in the 70s, and there was this large excavation force all across Lower Nubia, there was a lot that was excavated. And people found out a lot of information about the Nubians in Lower Nubia, but then it raised just as many questions. But because it was flooded, there was no way to answer those questions. So the archaeology of this time period is kind of stunted, or in this area of Lower Nubia, because we can't go back and excavate to answer any more questions. This is the location of the Aswan High Dam, the newest one, or the newer one. That was the original dam that was built like in 1906. So that's the second, the shorter one. And that's the lock of the original dam. So it wasn't very large in comparison. So when we look at what's the, at Aswan, so that's where the dam is. And if you look, all of that area that's flooded from Aswan down here to the south, that's a lot of flooding. That's a lot of area that is lost archaeologically. If you look at that, where the yellow arrow is, and you see that little kind of like strange squiggle, that's the border between Egypt and Sudan. So part of the dam was flooding into Sudan. And so they had to come to an agreement about, water rights and all this. So part of the negotiation was for Sudan to get access to some of that water that's being dammed there in Sudan. So that's Sudanese border. What do we know currently, or what efforts do we have currently? Jeff Emberling, when he did his lecture, and I want to thank the people that have gone before me. So Solange Ashby and Jeff Emberling, they gave wonderful presentations. Denise Doxey is coming after, and I know she's going to do a wonderful job as well, covering some of this material. But Jeff talked about the fact that there's a movement to do more settlement archaeology. We know how the kings and queens lived, but we don't know how regular people lived. So that's one of the kind of current moves. Charles Bonnet has done fantastic work at Kerma, which is the original Cushite site. Working there over 30 years, he was able to first kind of lay out the town site. So this is what we have on the left. When George Reisner first went there, again, perspective and context, he said he interpreted it as being an Egyptian outpost because the Nubians had no history. The Nubians were African, they had no history. Africa has no history. That was the attitude of early Egyptologists and historians. So they could not have built this. So there were all kinds of explanations about these sites that were being discovered in Nubia, that they weren't being built by the people that were there, that they were built by Egyptians. So, but Charles Bonnet work has shown the very elaborate nature of these sites. This site in particular, the cover of the book is Dookie Gale, which is a little bit upstream, downstream from Kerma, but it's also a Kerma site. But he excavated the Egyptian temple site. So when Thutmose came down during that conquering period, that New Kingdom colonization,
he built a temple there. After he defeated the people at Kerma, he built a temple, which the Cushites burned down in rebellion. And most of the third and Hatshepsut had to rebuild it. But the attitude of most Egyptologists was, when you get to the Egyptian temple, because the Nubians would build on top of, so you would have Cushite temples that were built by the people of Napata and Merowe. They would build onto those temples. But the approach or the ideology of Egyptologists, when you get down, you excavate down to the Egyptian temple, stop, because there's nothing else there. Charles Bonnet didn't do that. He kept digging. So what you see on the cover of this book is what was below the Egyptian temple. This huge religious site. And he even said that there's nothing like it. It's definitely not Egyptian. It's African. African meaning it's Nubian, but I mean, there are no parallels. There are no Egyptian parallels. So this is totally Nubian. So he's showing that the Nubians were capable of creating their own religious and sacred sites without Egyptian, I don't say interference, but Egyptian influence. But even when they adopted Egyptian culture, they adapted the aspects. They adopted the aspects that they wanted that would help them to best show their cultural and religious traits. They didn't adopt everything wholeheartedly. So this is a model of the Kerma town site that they were able to reconstruct, and this is just one side of the region. The town site's on one side of the river. The other side of the river was the burial site, and then upstream was the Duki Gel site, the religious site. But this is also religious and site of a palace as well. So finally, I think this is the last few slides. He's discovered, when he excavated that Egyptian temple, he found a well. And there were these statues found in the well. And this is like this is like early 2000s. So this was something it was really big when it happened. Like, wow, somebody found some more statues, some royal statues. So some of them are 25th dynasty, and Senkamanaskin, which is one of the king that is in the exhibit, his statue he's one of these statues. But I show these here to talk about the Cushite elements in the royal regalia. So even when the Nubians adopted the Egyptian style, they still did things to let people know, I'm Nubian, I'm Cushite. So what were those things? So you notice that he has two uraei. So there's the cobra that sits on top of the king's crown. That's not Egyptian. They only wore one. They wore two, because they were showing we're the kings of both Cush and Egypt. We're the real two lands, not upper and lower. We're the kings of two lands. What else? You see the ram's horn over the ear. This becomes really prominent during the Meroitic period. You will see even the queens will have a ram's horn around the ear. So they're signifying their relationship to the god Amun. So even though they worshiped Amun, the manifestation of Amun in Nubia was of a ram. So whenever you see the ram, they're making reference to the god Amun, the way that they understand it in worship. So the ram's horn is showing the relationship with Amun. What else? You see the armlets. Now, Egyptian men, they wore bracelets and stuff, but Nubian men, they wore armlets, they wore bracelets, they wore earrings, they were, as people would say, they were dripping. Armlets, and he's even wearing anklets. What else? This one is totally Nubian, this necklace. And even though you can barely see it, you see it on every last one of these statues around the neck. It is the triple ram's head necklace. So it's Amun, again, the relationship with Amun, but it's the pendant and then on two sides, and they were all gold. So again, showing that relationship between Amun, but you don't see that in Egypt, but you see that in Nubia. And finally, the skull cap crown. So even when you look at this, or you look at another Nubian scene, you can look at it. If you look at it really closely and you know what you're looking at, you can see that there are elements that show that this person is Nubian or Cushite, and they're showing their identity in that certain way. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get to the end. In talking about perspective and context, when Egyptologists were saying that Africans had no history, that Nubians could not have possibly built these things that they were finding in Nubia, there are men and women, African American, African Caribbean, who fought back. They were fighting against this narrative that Africa has no history. And they were fighting for their very existence as human beings. So we look at some of the writings of these 19th and 20th century writers and scholars, and we understand that they were laying that first foundation of creating a counter narrative. So a lot of people don't know their names, they don't recognize their writings, but they are to be credited with being that first vanguard to say, we are creating a counter narrative. We totally reject the argument, the narrative that Africa has no history, and they're writing that history. And finally, William Leo Hansberry is the man that everybody should know. William Leo Hansberry was the first Africanist in this country. He was the first to teach African studies in this country, and actually this academic year represents the centennial, 100 years of African studies this year by this man, William Leo Hansberry. And I could say more, but I'm out of time, so I want to thank you all for your time.
Right, thank you so much for a really wide-ranging and fascinating talk. Deborah has kindly agreed to take a few questions. We are a bit over time, so we'll take maybe just a few. It looks like we have a couple questions here in person. There's one down here and a couple back there.
Hello. Yes, I would love to ask the question, what was the relationship between the kingdom of Punt and Nubia? And the second part would be, how much do we know about the history of Punt?
Right, so Punt is one of those areas that needs a lot more investigation. What we know about Punt, basically we get from the Egyptian records. So of course from Hatshepsut, because she had that large expedition to Punt. But there are inscriptions that show that there were expeditions to Punt even during the Old Kingdom. But there are no records that we have as of yet that shows a relationship between Punt and Nubia. But I mean, there should be, because I'm sure that they were involved in some kind of trade relationship. But that's one of those areas that needs more investigation. We definitely need to put a little bit more effort into studying Punt. So thank you for that question.
We'll take a Zoom question. There are a couple of questions coming through on Zoom about ancient Nubian religion and the pantheon and its relationship to the Egyptian pantheon. You touched on the supreme god Amun, but what do we know about local Nubian religion and its relationship with the Egyptian pantheon?
So what we believe, because, and I did mention that the manifestation of Amun that's worshipped in Nubia is the ram. So there is the belief that there was a pre-existing ram god in Nubia that was syncretized with Amun. As far as other indigenous gods, we have, later we have Epidemic, which is a lion-headed god, but that's during the Meroitic period. There's also Arn-Sanufis. So there are a few Nubian gods that make it, and Arn-Sanufis is actually a part of the Egyptian pantheon as well. Dedwin is another Nubian god that's a part of the Egyptian pantheon. So there's this kind of crossover. But as far as the early periods, what were the Nubian gods that were worshipped before Amun was worshipped in Nubia, we don't know. And that's another reason why we need to spend time excavating below these Egyptian temples, because we need to know what were the indigenous ways of practicing religion before the Egyptians got there. So that's another area that we need to focus on moving forward with future archaeology.
Hotep.
Hello, Hotep.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, when I was in Egypt, we saw ram's heads on both sides. It was a long row. I can't remember what city it was, but are you saying that?
Oh, that is probably connecting Luxor and Karnak temples. Okay. The Avenue of the Sphinxes. I mean, the Avenue of the Rams.
Yes, Avenue of the Rams. Okay. So that's Nubian.
No, so in Egypt, so the gods of Egypt also had like sacred animals or symbols that were intimately related to them. So one of the symbols for Amun is a ram. But Amun, the god, the Egyptian god, is always depicted as this human-headed god. But he also, you would see like on the barks that would hold the image of the god that would, be in procession from temple to temple. You would have on the front the aegis or the shield, and it would have a ram on the front. So that let you know that the contents of that bark, who was inside of it, was Amun. But that was his sacred animal. So he was also represented as a goose. In Nubia, it's always the ram-headed Amun that you're dealing with. Whenever you see the human-headed Amun in Nubia, they're talking about Amun of Thebes. It's the Egyptian Amun. So you will see him in those temples as well. But all of the strictly Nubian manifestations of Amun are various ram, either fully ram or ram-headed. And sometimes you could tell just the way that the horns are depicted, which temple he's associated.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you so much for that well-researched and thorough talk. My question has to do with the visual comparison between the female leaders of the Egypt and Nubia. For example, Hatshepsut had to don on a very male clothing and identity to assert her power. But as you well showed, the Nubian female leaders were able to get their hair done and their nails and retain their feminine identity.
Exactly.
Why?
Well, I can't answer totally for the Egyptian side of it, but it seems as if the Nubians did not have a problem with women exercising power. And also, women were seen in a very, I won't say a very different light, but they had a different relationship to the throne. So you would have I mean, you had the queen mother in Egypt, and she had an exalted status. But in Nubia, the queen mother was so exalted when the king was crowned, like his mother was there. You might not see his wife, but you were going to see his mother. And he, in his inscription, he would talk about how his mother came from Nubia and how everybody was cheering and, so it reminds me of, football players and entertainers, how they reach a certain high status and then the person that they think is their mother. It reminded me of that. So the Nubians had a very, very exalted way that they looked at women. Not to say that the Egyptians didn't, but it was just a little different. Because you're right, Hatshepsut is one of my favorites of Egyptian history. But she would have to take on the male pronoun, and the Nubian women didn't have to do that. The Cushite women were, yes, I'm a woman, and and nobody ever. There was nothing to say that that they thought that was strange, or I think part of it, though, has to do with the mythology. So in the Egyptian mythology, the king is Horus, who's male. So if you're going to be the pharaoh and you are the earthly manifestation of Horus, but you're female, that's kind of a contradiction. You got to do some. They didn't have that in Nubia. You just rule on your own.
All right, so I think we have time for maybe one last question. Okay. So going back to Zoom, there's a question about if you can go back to the slide showing the tomb painting from Hui from the 18th dynasty. And we're seeing the people of Nubia bringing all of these very coveted natural resources to the Egyptians, as well as some of them appear to be leading children with them. So could you speak a little bit more about the natural resources there that were coveted outside of Nubia? They're bringing cattle, there's a giraffe, there's gold, there's children. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
So one of the things that made the Nubian chiefs and kings wealthy was their position along the Nile River. They were situated so that those trade goods that were coming from further south in Africa passed through. And so they would, some of the temples that we have in Upper Nubia also have treasuries associated with them. So one of the temples that's in my dissertation, they found a whole, what they call a treasury, that's at the mouth of this wadi coming from, so people would get off the river and come across the desert to make a shortcut. And there's a huge building that was excavated that had like decayed elephant tusk. So not even hippopotamus, but long elephant tusk. So they were getting, you probably had to pay a tax to get through. So they were getting portions of things that were coming through, going to Egypt and going outside to the Mediterranean to the east. So you have these rare exotic animals that don't exist in Nubia either, but they're coming from further south. But they're some of the things, they're different kinds of course, the gold of Nubia maintained the peace during the 18th and 19th dynasties, when they're dealing with the Babylonians and then the Assyrians becoming more powerful in the east. They, I won't say they propped up, but they helped those chiefs and kings that were in Syria and Palestine area that were a buffer between Egypt and the Assyrians. So they paid them. That Mitanni was one of those places that was shown as the enemy. They took Mitanni princesses to marry Egyptian kings. So part of what fueled that peace was Nubian gold. They exported a lot of gold. And we know that because there are records from some of those kings that were found in Egypt saying, hey, where's my gold? I thought, you're my brother. I thought you were supposed to send me. I can't build without that gold. But yeah, so we have, you have, I don't know if it's in this one, but monkeys that were coming from further south, the giraffes, all kinds of big panther skins. The panther skin was synonymous with being like the high priest. And that they didn't get that in Egypt. That was something that came from further south. So you had, all these other kinds of big cat skins, and different kinds of. I think that there's some. I don't know what kind of food source, food stuff that is, but there's other kinds of things that are being presented, other than just natural resource food too. So things that were coming from further south in Africa was being imported as well.
All right, thank you. Well, I think we need to wrap it up there.